get into later.
I'm curious, your quick response to the responses. I mean, when I just want to jump in and I see they're implementing, or they say their commitment is that they're already implementing in part. For other of your recommendations, they're assessing the feasibility. When you read the response, in short, what was your reaction?
First of all, I have a reaction that it is really good that there is a response. And this sort of back and forth between independent recommendations being made publicly to Meta and Meta making responses to those recommendations is unusual, right? That it's not like lots of companies go through that same process. The same with the oversight board. So first of all, I welcome the fact that we were able to make those recommendations, that lots of civil society organizations and activists were able to input into that, and that Meta responded. I mean, it felt good to know that there's only one recommendation that they're not following through on. There's only one recommendation they disagree with. It is understandable that it takes some time to review how and whether to implement some recommendations, but just because of how complicated content moderation is in practice, and very heartening to see that they are acting on quite a few of them.
It's certainly a glass half full approach, and I appreciate that. I mean, just for our audience, I believe that one that you referred to about the only recommendation they're not acting on, it's the one for funding public research into the relationship between counterterrorism obligations, and people can dig into all of that. Without further ado, I want to get Diala in on this. When we talk about these terrorism designations that some of us have personal experience with, that we've touched on, through your work, Diala, I know at the Center for Constitutional Rights, you've seen how false accusations of terrorism disproportionately impact Arab communities, Muslim communities. This same issue seems to be one of the primary causes, if I may say, leading to Palestinians being censored on Meta's platforms. Meta claims, of course, that they're simply obligated to act as they do because of US material support of terrorism laws. So could you break that down? Could you explain to us what material support of terrorism laws are and what types of obligations US-based companies really do have to abide by?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you all. So US federal law and accompanying regulations criminalize what's called providing material support to terrorism. And that it includes to groups that are designated by the US through a formal process as foreign terrorist organizations. The word material support is also broadly defined and includes things like services and personnel, in addition to the more typical tangible materials such as money or other kinds of materials that one would typically imagine. And in a famous or notorious Supreme Court case, it's called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, the Supreme Court actually upheld that law, saying that it was not too broad, even though the plaintiffs in that case were saying that it was preventing them from engaging in certain kinds of political advocacy that was completely nonviolent, but arguably also commendable, right, with designated organizations. So things like teaching people about how to petition the United Nations, or teaching members of these groups, of these designated groups, about international law, that kind of thing. So the law is broad, and therefore it lends itself to overreach. The law also disproportionately, as you noted, targets Arabs and Muslims. So the majority of the names on the FTO lists are based in Arab and Muslim regions. So the majority of organizations are Arab or Muslim organizations, or are otherwise associated with Arab or Muslim groups. And of course, the political climate, especially post September 11th, means that law enforcement resources have targeted those communities also disproportionately. So the specter of criminal enforcement of these laws has had some, by now, well-documented, well-known chilling effects on Arab and Muslim rights, including speech and association, things like charitable giving. People aren't sure where the lines are drawn around who will count as a member of a terrorist organization or what will count as material support. And so they'll simply not want to draw additional scrutiny to themselves, and they will refrain from giving altogether. That was the sort of chilling effect that Mona also mentioned. And that disproportionate chilling effect impacts disproportionately, some of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities and opinions. Now, it's important to note that this is in many ways by design, right? So the government has stated at various points that they intend to render certain political causes or organizations radioactive. So these laws are broad by design. And then For our purposes, something that is often ignored or not spoken about enough is what is arguably an overrepresentation of Palestinian organizations on that list. So not just Arab or Muslim groups, Palestinian, right? And in many ways, the list's genesis is to target Palestinian political activity. Most Palestinian political factions are designated terrorist organizations, including, of course, Hamas, which is, the part of the government in Gaza. Palestinian political life is thus particularly scrutinized by US law enforcement agencies, and therefore the FTO lists and their resulting prohibitions reflect in many ways a US government disfavor of certain Palestinian political groups or narratives over others, right? And it's sort of putting its thumb on the scale in this, as well as many other ways that it does all the time, on what it calls this sort of Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
And so we've definitely seen overreach in this space, government overreach in this space. Many civil rights groups have documented and noted the way that US government prosecutions under material support to terrorism laws have been discriminatory. They're full of problems and lots of examples of overreach at multiple stages of investigation to prosecution. But I just want to note one more thing. I've thus far spoken about the criminal consequences of these laws, but significantly also US federal law has a civil provision to it. So what that means is that individual actors, private actors, you or me, could, of their own initiative, drag someone into court for accusing them of material support to terrorism. They can sue them. And this is actually where we see a lot of the action in this space. In the past few years, we've seen an alarming rise of efforts to use or abuse US legal mechanisms to target companies and advocates and funders who engage with Palestinian human rights advocacy. So, for example, we represent one such organizations in a lawsuit. A Palestinian human rights group was in the US, is sued under the material support provisions for supporting terrorism by the Jewish National Fund, which is sort of an Israeli quasi-governmental organization. And even though the claims in these cases are implausible, usually totally unsubstantiated, still, drag someone through a legal process, investing lots of time, lots of resources, lots of energy in defending against these kinds of suits, right? So that's a really important part of the sort of legal context to these.
No, it's an important point, and because you talk about civil actors, I appreciate all that context. There are civil sort of society actors, like Hamle included, that have suggested that Meta is over-complying. And it's not just them, right? Specifically with US material support of terrorism laws. So I'm wondering, that coupled with the criticism that they're perpetuating a biased and discriminatory system against Palestinians through these false terrorism designations, in your sort of legal analytical mind, what do you make of that claim? Is it undeniable? What water does it hold?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I'm a lawyer, but I also know that the law doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is given meaning by all of us, whether it's advocates, whether it's the opposition, whether it's Meta. And so, for example, Dustin was mentioning the overrepresentation of Arabic reviewers at the Meta. And that is a way of generating more content to review under these laws that is Arabic, as opposed to in other languages, right? So you operationalize these laws through various decisions that you make along the way. So remember, these companies, they don't have the same kind of risk tolerance as, say, a mission-driven organization does. They are for profit, and so they're looking at their bottom lines when they're assessing risk, right? Setting aside all the language about speech and the values that they uphold, there are also bottom lines that they are looking at. Also, their employees are not educated or informed about the factual and political context in the same ways that somebody who, people on this webinar are. So the example in the report that really stands out to me is the removal of the content that references Al-Aqsa. And that's a really great example of how these two things can converge, right? The legal framework, as well as the kind of lack of education. Al-Aqsa, of course, is a name of one of the holiest sites in Islam. It is in Jerusalem. It is a site of regular human rights abuses perpetrated by the Israeli army or police against worshippers, and is also a very newsworthy site, right? Events like marches by extremist Israelis, like mass prayer, it's newsworthy. But for meta reviewers, that aspect was entirely ignored. And the fact that a designated group that has Al-Aqsa, the word, as part of its name, is what animated their implementation. And so the removal of all the content that referenced Al-Aqsa, especially when all of this activity was happening around the mosque. The same is true for Meta's removal of language that is part of its policy that praises certain organizations that they deem to be dangerous. It's another example of over-enforcement.
Right.
So just to be clear, at a very basic level, advocacy that is independent is protected legally. I can scream as often as I want that I support a designated group. As long as I do that independently, there is nothing illegal about my doing that. As long as I'm not doing it on behalf of or
أقوم بالدعم بشكل فردي.
I'm sorry, I just heard the translation come in.
Me too.
I think that our translator has had a little bit of technical difficulty. So if we could just take a pause really quickly to ensure that the translator gets the correct access back.
Yes. I'm on. No, I'm Ahmed, I'm in.
Yeah, no, I know you're here with us, but unfortunately, there we go. I think we're good now.
Yeah, she just has to mute herself, I think, on this. Okay.
Is that yeah? If you can mute yourself, there we go on the main chat, I guess. Okay, great. Continue. In fact, I don't want to cut you off, but I did want to move along. But finish your thought.
Well, I just want to make sure I flag one last thing. You know, the reason we also see over enforcement is that we have these civil suits, and so groups like Meta are also looking at what is happening in this political climate, which includes very aggressive practice by many litigants of bringing these cases against companies, and that is a necessary sort of context here, and they're looking at that, and they're sort of doing their risk assessment, not necessarily about whether or not they're going to be criminally liable, but they're looking at the sort of numbers and how much time it's going to take them to defend against this. And that results in overcompliance, and that is again the intended outcome of these private efforts to sort of weaponize U.S. counterterrorism laws that are prone to abuse, that lend themselves to that weaponization in many ways. But it's a sort of cycle of abuse that is how this all kind of ends up shaking out.
No, I appreciate that. Dunstan, I'm curious. BCR published the report and Meta published the response, as we said, but looking forward, what happens now in your mind? I mean, in your experience, what are the kinds of sort of mechanisms that actually can ensure corporations, in this case Meta, can make progress and positive changes? Not just about, specifically to protect human rights.
Yeah, so let me just start by saying I think it's very good to have seen that this work is published, and a lot of credit must go to civil society organizations and activists for advocacy, and for the Oversight Board for making this recommendation, and for Meta for publishing the results, because that does create the context in which a lot more accountability can take place. So one key thing to watch over time is Meta's commitment to publish an annual human rights report that will present their progress on human rights and their sort of intentions going forward when it comes to human rights. So that would be the key place, as I understand it, where they will report back on progress against the recommendations we've made. And what I do see is they have a very sort of disciplined, thorough, methodical process internally to track progress against the recommendations. So what you've seen is their response to the 21 recommendations, and they do have processes internally to track that progress. One thing that did come to mind with this question, however, is what I've just described is a voluntary activity, right? Meta has made that commitment to publish annual human rights reports. That's not something that's required of them. But we're about to hit a period of time where that's going to change. So the European Union is introducing a corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which is going to make human rights due diligence mandatory for all companies. doing business in Europe, so not just European companies, but all companies doing business in Europe. And there will be a corporate sustainability reporting directive, which is going to make transparency in reporting a mandatory requirement in Europe. So that will be one place where you can see the follow-up. And I hope where we'll see disclosure from other companies. You know, one thing I'm very conscious of every time we do a human rights assessment like this is we can make great recommendations to this one company that are very important. However, lots of other companies are also relevant. And I hope the report is used to surface questions and issues that would be relevant for other companies as well. And that other companies start to have a conversation about, for example, how content is moderated in Arabic, English, Hebrew, across different platforms as well. And you're mute.
Ahmed, you are muted.
Thank you. I was just saying, you know, it's a microcosm, I guess. It's odd when Meta, which is so big, is, you know, an example of so many others, but it's good to have that reminder. Muna, I'm curious, at this point in the campaign, what are the demands to Meta? What are you settling on? Like,
so for a long time, we have different demands from Meta. After May 2021, we asked Meta for we recommended Meta 5 basic recommendations. One of them was that human rights due diligence, but we have other 4 recommendations. I'll start with them and then I'll conclude with the report related recommendations. The first one is basically the Meta should be much more transparent with the government requests that they are receiving, not only whenever they are receiving the legal requests, but because also Meta is receiving requests from the Israeli cyber unit. And this was like a big point, and we've talked before with Dunstan and with the BSR people about this, but like the report is like lack the root causes behind this kind of bias from Meta, which is the relationship between the cyber unit and Meta, where they are sending thousands of requests to Meta every year, and Meta is aligning or is adapting 90% of those requests, and this is basically causing harm for Palestinian content, Palestinian narrative, and increasing the censorship against Palestinians on Meta's platforms. So Meta should include those numbers, and the numbers that we usually have around the cyber unit are from the cyber unit itself, but we've never heard about those numbers from Meta. Meta was never transparent about any kind of numbers around this. The other one is the automation transparency. So when Meta is using automated moderation, or when they are using human moderators to moderate the content, they should be transparent about that so people can understand. And whenever there is false positive cases, I mean, whenever we are restoring such kind of content and there is a mistake, so we can understand where is the mistake is happening. Is it from the automated and the AI system, or it's from the human moderators? We were demanding Meta for a very long time to get more transparency about the dangerous organizations, because Meta never published their DOI list. Earlier this year, it was published by The Intercept, and this is a leaked list, but we are not sure that this is the most updated list. So Meta should be transparent about the DOI list, the designation process, and also if someone is designated, like either individual or organization, they should also know that, so they can appeal, or they can take action, the suitable action for that. And the other thing is Meta should commit to co-design with the civil society organizations, because if they continue designing their policies without like consulting and co-designing that, not only consulting after they are designing it, the local civil society organizations, then we will or they will repeat the same mistakes that is happening. And because of that, we have been demanding the co-design process for a very long time, and we are stressing on that. On the other hand, and based on the 21 recommendations that Dunstan and his team recommended in the report, we are demanding Meta to implement those 21 recommendations. Meta already announced that they started recommending some of them, but they also said that there is one of those recommendations that they are not planning, or they are rejecting, they are not planning to implement. And we are asking Meta to implement the 21 recommendations, although we don't fully agree with the 21 recommendations, and we discussed that with Dunstan from before, but we are accepting them because they are an independent party who conducted this due diligence, and we are asking Meta to give us a detailed timetable or timeline on how they are going to implement those policies. When we launched our campaign last month, we told Meta that we are giving them 60 days to announce this timeline, but till now we didn't hear back from Meta, so we are not sure what's happening there. So maybe this could be a gentle reminder if someone from Meta is hearing us, that it's already the 60 days almost done. So we are still waiting to hear from them on how they are going to implement the recommendations of the BSR report. I think I'll stop here, but like if there's any questions from the audience or you have that, Ahmed, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you. I did, I couldn't help but wonder about the actual oversight board of Facebook, because it has the former Israeli Justice Minister, who is Amy Palmore, I believe, who was kind of well known for setting up a cyber unit back in Israel, and has, I hear a lot of rumors about that, but I just thought I'd throw that into this conversation before wrapping and going to the Q&A, so we can hear all of your much more hard-hitting questions. I want to ask you, Dayala, so we know that Meta's business practices and their policies have led to, let's put it lightly, negative human rights implications for Palestinians. In your mind, I'm curious, what kind of legal mechanisms are there, or are there ways, what can be done legally, realistically, to hold Meta accountable in this context?
I really appreciate that question and have no sort of good legal answers. I think this is where, exactly as Dunstan laid out, this is where the importance of civil society work and advocacy work really kind of is illustrated. So ultimately, the available legal mechanisms are limited in terms of social media companies in the US, certainly, and familiarity with the EU context, but I suspect it's similar there, although there's some positive developments certainly underway that Dunstan was referencing. Many advocates in the US have, of course, taken a position that that there should be more regulating of social media platforms, and that unlike what Meta and others argue, that the First Amendment doesn't apply to social media platforms, that there's a lot of certainly arguments that shouldn't be the case. But ultimately, the kinds of reviews and self-regulations are all of these companies' own initiatives. So they're all voluntary, they're all discretionary, they're all in the direction of sort of setting industry standards, and they're not as much required by law, and so that really does limit the avenues for enforcement on goodwill. And of course, that changes when the climate change, that kind of thing. So really, this is just a call for the importance of political organizing.
Right. And sorry, I don't know if you're just cutting off for me or if you're cutting off for others as well, but perhaps it's my internet. Can everyone hear me? Anyone? Okay. All I will say is, yeah, you got cut off. So all the more reason to have these sorts of conversations. And so with that said, I do want to turn it over to Eric, who can introduce some of your questions to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, and hopefully Dayala will be able to join us shortly. We will try and get through as many of these questions as possible, so please continue to put them into the Q&A, and we will make do as well as we can. The first question is directed towards Dunstan, and it's a really important question around some clarification as to what you found in the report. So we know shadow banning is an extremely important and horrible occurrence of censorship that happens on social media. And for those of you that don't know, shadow banning is when the viewership of somebody's content is extremely lessened. So for example, if somebody posts a story on Instagram and they usually receive 50,000 views, but a certain story is shadow banned, they might only receive 10,000 views. So that's obviously much lower than they are used to, and it is lessening the reach of their content. So Dunstan, one of our participants is asking if you were able to investigate issues of shadow banning and if there is anything that you can actually measure there to prove. And also in a similar vein, you mentioned that there was unintentional bias, and our audience was interested in understanding a little bit more what you mean by unintentional bias and how you distinguish that from intentional bias.
Yeah, so good question. So we did review the question of visibility and the distribution of content, and it does get very complicated. It is harder to measure than, you know, a post being up or down or account being suspended or not suspended. It is a harder thing to investigate, but there is some content in the report that addresses that work, that research, and what we found. So we highlight 3 potential factors that might impact the visibility of content. One is essentially the enforcement penalties applied to content policy violations. So you may have a content policy violation that results in reduced searchability or visibility of content. Right, so that's one element that might impact visibility. The second was that Meta at the time implemented some content neutral, so by that we mean it applies to all users, break the glass measures for Israel and Palestine during May 2021 that reduced the visibility of all repeatedly reshared content. So if content was being repeatedly reshared, it was less likely to be how should I say it, have less visibility during that particular period of time. And then there were the 2 Instagram glitches that affected the reach of stories, in particular on May the 5th and May the 6th. So we did investigate the question of visibility. It was a much harder thing to investigate than other things, and those were the conclusions we reached. On bias, let me just find the right text here to give you the correct answer. So the Oversight Board did ask us to address, or ask Meta to address, this question of bias, but didn't define what they meant by bias. So we had to sort of define for ourselves how we were going to interpret bias in order to do the assessment. And we describe our definition of bias in the report. We distinguished between intentional bias, where some people are deliberately treated differently than others, and unintentional bias, where policies and processes may be neutral on their face or in place for reasons of legal compliance, as we've just discussed, that impact some people differently than others. We also looked at bias at the level of content policy. So is there bias in policy? And we looked at bias at the level of the overall content moderation system, so how policy is enforced. So we did reach the unintentional bias sort of conclusion, but for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that we concluded that there was bias. We identified the root causes of that bias, and we made recommendations for how that bias should be addressed. So I'd really point to people towards that sort of main conclusion. Here's how we think bias is manifesting in content moderation, and here's what should be done to address it.
Thanks, Dunstan. I appreciate that. And on that last note, I'll just use my moderator privilege to also point out that Hamla and a lot of other folks are response to the unintentional bias issue is that we have been pointing out these issues to Meta for years now. And so we feel as though even if the bias started out as unintentional, because we have been making them aware of it for years, that unintentional bias then becomes intentional when they do not act. So I just wanted to make a quick note there as to what our commentary and analysis of the situation is. But thank you, Dunstan. That helps clear things out quite a bit. Mona, I want to shift it to you because we have a lot of questions from our participants around how this moderation is actually happening. Are there actors within Meta, human individuals that say this content needs to be taken down, this account needs to be taken down? Where is automation coming into the play? So can you kind of just give us a brief description of how we know this moderation to be playing within Meta?
Yes, thanks, Eric. So basically, Meta is using 3 classifiers, which how they are moderating the content. So one of them is the human moderators, the other one is the artificial intelligence and how they are marking that. And in a very recent conversation, we've seen that 97% of the content takedown or the content moderation is happening by their AI system. And only 3% like it's human moderators. And this is like alarming for us, because as much as we are in just like relying on the machine and on artificial intelligence, then there might be a certain kind of repetitive mistakes that's happening there, and we are not aware about that because, as I mentioned from before, we are escalating cases to Meta, and in many times we are able to restore this content because it doesn't violate the community standards there, and it's just being taken down by mistake. It happened several times. One of them was actually 3 months ago or something, a couple of months ago, when they closed Al-Qastal Facebook page. Al-Qastal is one of the, actually it's the only media outlet that is live streaming from Jerusalem, especially when there's escalation on the ground. And when it was taken down, it was taken down by mistake. And this means in time of escalations that the narrative of Palestinians in Jerusalem, the attacks, the human rights violations against Palestinians in Jerusalem, it's not live streamed, it's not on the platform. And there is another, like the other side, which is the Israeli side. They have a propaganda machine where they are spreading their narrative, spreading whatever they think that it should be spread at this time. And this, like, it has implications on how we see human rights violations, how it's documented, but also on the spread of narrative and which narrative is taking over, and how also, because part of the Israeli narrative, sometimes it includes or it has disinformation, as happened when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, and they spread disinformation that she was killed by a Palestinian gunman, and then like 5 or 6 investigations by international media organizations and the human rights organizations confirmed that she was killed by the Israeli soldiers. And till now, Meta did not label the Israeli content as disinformation content, or they didn't take any kind of action. And we can take this case and implement it on the wider Palestinian-Israeli scene, where this information is being spread and it's not moderated. Palestinian content, which is basically documented human rights violation, is being taken down. And on the other times, when there is a human moderators are reviewing the content, they also have mistakes. For example, last May in May 2021, they had a mistake when the Al-Aqsa hashtag was disappeared, or the content on Al-Aqsa hashtag was disappeared. And basically, this was a mistake of a human moderator, because they misunderstood misunderstood what is Al-Aqsa. They thought Al-Aqsa is Al-Aqsa Brigades, which is on the DOI list that Diala talked about. But later on, it was not. And when people were using Al-Aqsa, they meant Al-Aqsa, which is, as we mentioned before, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the most most for Muslims around the world. So mistakes happen, whether by human moderators or by machine learning. But the most important issue on how they can adapt, how when Meta is hiring also human moderators, they should have the context. They should be from the region. They should be even from the country, because they can't understand the nuances and they can't understand the context if they are not from there, as well as the dialect, because some words in Palestinian dialect, it's totally different when it's in another dialect like the Moroccan dialect, or even any other like Arabic dialect. So there are a certain kind of problems that's happening here and there with the moderation that's happening either with the human moderators or with the artificial intelligence, or the automated moderation.
Thanks, Mona. That's super helpful, and it's complicated, right? And I think that's part of the problem, is that it does get a little bit complicated quite quickly. I want to pause really quickly because there was a comment around, what do I do if I feel as though my content about Palestine is being censored on the platform? And Hamle runs the Palestinian Digital Observatory for digital rights violations. And I linked to that in the chat. If you feel as though your content or your account has been taken down unjustly, please submit a case and we will work with you to get your content or your account reinstated. But with that, I want to shift the conversation back to the legal realm. So Diala, I will pose this question to you, and we'll see what thoughts you have on this. It says, is there a possibility that the new EU regulations on upholding human rights will clash with the current US anti-terrorism regulations? And if so, who will have to adjudicate?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, with a disclaimer that I'm certainly not an expert in EU law, that general tension is one that we're very familiar with, that exists, in the US also, and sort of human rights and civil liberties clash with, overbroad counterterrorism laws. So I suspect that, yes, there are going to be many points and areas where there will be such a clash. Who adjudicates them, I suspect, is, hopefully there is some kind of meaningful review there. I think one thing that I'd be curious to look into more, I mean, sitting here from the vantage of the United States, it's easy to think that it is easy to see everything through that lens, but we are exporting our counterterrorism framework and apparatus, whether it's by making other countries kind of adopt similar things, or whether it's simply through the sort of extraterritorial reach and application of our laws, through things like leveraging people's concerns around material support, running afoul to U.S. Criminal law, as well as being potentially liable under our material support to terrorism laws. So I also think that that's another space where you'll see a clash, even if that tension is resolvable in the EU context. We'll continue to have this very sort of US centric, very rigid interpretation of laws, and I hope that we can find ways to overcome that. Unfortunately, when these two things have clashed repeatedly over the last many decades, it tends to be the sort of, quote, national security, although I don't like to use that term, logic that takes the day. And so I think really what we want to do is see more of the human rights and free speech, free association kind of logic be centered more.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And it looks like we are coming up on time. So I have one last question that is headline just from this morning that I will ask Dunstan to weigh in on first, and then Mona, maybe you can also give a couple of thoughts before handing it back to Ahmed. But just this morning, Meta announced that they are going to lay off over 11,000 employees. So that's obviously a huge number, a huge cut to their staff. I think it's about 13% of their staff. So what do those layoffs potentially mean for the implementation of the recommendations of this report, and for kind of ensuring the protection of digital rights on Meta's platforms in general at large?
Yeah, and I'm afraid I don't know enough about the specifics to sort of get into the detail of the answer to that question. But what I would say is it's worth thinking about, how does change happen inside companies, right? That's the question at stake here ultimately. And sorry, my other phone's going off. Let me stop that. And you do have a central human rights team whose task it is to oversee human rights due diligence and to surface risks and to try to ensure that the company has in place approaches to avoid, prevent, mitigate, and remedy harms. The human rights team doesn't do all of that, right? You need to embed human rights across the entire company. All sorts of policies, all sorts of teams, all sorts of processes are relevant. And so it will be important to keep an eye on that sort of overall theory of change at Meta, rather than thinking too much about particular teams and particular headcount. It is also always a very sad day when this happens. There's a lot of people who've done very good work at Meta who I'm assuming are having a quite a challenging day.
Thanks. Yeah, Mona, do you want to chime in here as well?
So we usually ask Meta to invest more on like hire more people to kind of getting or improving people's experience on their platforms. So I hope it won't affect, but to be honest, I think it will affect the people's or the users' experience, especially when it comes to the content moderation. Even like we know that they are outsourcing the human moderators. They are working with companies to moderate their content after they train them, as they explained several times. But I'm concerned that this also will affect how their content moderation will be working or will continue to be working. And we usually stress on hiring more, investing more in specialized and people who are specialized in the context, but also with the delegates. So that's alarming. And I mean, those big tech companies are usually trying to cutting cost to increase profit, and with the tech giants who are making billions of dollars annually, they should invest more. It's their mission to do so. And even, for example, with the DOI, Meta, they designated so many individuals and organizations in Palestine, but they didn't do so with the Israelis, despite the fact that there are calls inside the Israeli government to designate more groups, militarize the groups as dangerous organizations. And we called on Meta at that time that they should conduct on the ground investigations around such kind of thing. And I expect that this needs much more resources, much more money, employ more people who are specialized in certain contexts. So I hope it won't affect, but I think it will. So let's see what will happen, and then we can see how this could influence our advocacy and our rights there.
Thanks. Yeah, certainly a concerning headline. I apologize to those of you that we did not get to your questions, but thank you for engaging in really thoughtful questions. And I'll pass it back to you, Ahmed, to close us out.
Thank you, Eric. I hope everyone learned something today. I mean, I certainly did. And I just want to leave us all with some top lines. I mean, it seems we definitely discussed and established that there are double standards in content moderation policies, that Palestinian narratives and stories are being sort of silenced, and that this is a violation of digital rights. We also talked about the chilling effect. I think too often we don't really realize the ramifications of that. I've certainly come to learn more and more what kind of impact that actually has. And so, I found it interesting in my research and preparation for this conversation that, according to Hamle's research, 2/3 of Palestinian youth are afraid to really be vocal about their political opinions online. So in short, if you engaged with us today, if you believe Meta must stop these practices, if you believe content moderation policies need to be equal and objective and transparent, you can always keep this conversation going. You can engage more with this on meta.hamle.org. And I want to just thank you all, Mona, Dunstan, Diana, Dayala rather, Eric and everyone for attending and engaging with this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.